Hey everyone, it's me again. Welcome to Chapter 3 on joints and skin clusters. Just like us humans, joints and bones make up our asset skeleton. In Maya and other 3D applications, we attach our skin, or geometry, to joints. Each joint acts as an influence upon our mesh. Joints are typically moved by a control rig, but in this lesson, we'll just be using the joints themselves. In the course materials for this chapter, you can find a model with 2 arms. This model was kindly provided by a former coworker, friend, and talented artist, Minji-san. Thanks, Minji. Let's start positioning our joints by going to Skeleton, Create Joints. Now when you click in the viewport, a joint will be created. However, you have to be careful when placing joints in 3D space because they may not end up exactly where you intend them to be. Let's take a step back. Before I create these joints, I'm going to go up here to the top where I have my snap options. Maya has this nice feature called Snap to Projected Center, so I'm going to go ahead and click on that. This will take our object's volume into consideration when placing the joints, which is a very nice feature when you're doing joint layout. I almost always start on my character's left side, then mirror everything over to the right. Let's start in the front view, and with Projected Center, we can lay out our joints for the arm. Start by putting my shoulder joint just above the armpit here. And then the elbow, which will be below our bicep. And then the wrist. Okay, let's take a look at this in perspective view. We're not completely satisfied with our placement and we want to change things around a little bit. Without moving the children of the joint, we can do this by pressing D to enter pivot mode. So now I can actually just make some slight adjustments, move things around a little bit more, and it's not affecting the children. Just keep in mind that when you do this, your joint becomes off axis. So look, it's no longer aiming at the next one, and that's not what we want. So we'll go over how to fix that a little bit later on in this lesson. Cool. If we're happy with our placement, let's just go ahead and name these. We'll call it left shoulder joint. We'll say left elbow joint, very descriptive, and left wrist joint. Awesome. Now let's go on and place our hand. I'll do that in front view again. When I'm rigging, I tend to treat each body part as its own module. So I like to give my hand its own separate joint from the wrist. If I go to my joint tool, go ahead and create joints again. And if I click on this wrist, what's going to happen is it will just append joints to that previous chain, which is not what we want. So I'm going to undo. My tool is still active. I'm going to click outside of this joint so it doesn't snap to it. Now, with the tool still active, I'll press and hold my V key, middle mouse drag, and snap to this joint. Now, I have a separate joint chain, and I can go ahead and click here to create my wrist's end joint. I'll go ahead and show you how to lay out the pinky, and then I'll just speed up the recording for the rest of the fingers. So let's position first our metacarpal joint, which goes somewhere around here. And then our knuckle. Keep in mind the knuckle is actually back here. I see a lot of people want to put it kind of close to this line, but that's not actually where the knuckle is if you look at your hand. And then for these other joints, you'll want to keep it on this crease. So we can actually do it from the side here, and our projected center still maintains a pretty nice average of the volume. We'll go ahead and do this one, and then the last point there. Very nice. You may have noticed that during the playback, I used a renamer tool on my shelf. Once I finish recording this series, I will do a separate video on how you can install and use this yourself. I'm waiting until the end because I plan on adding a few more things along the way. Hey there, this is Nick from the future relative to when I recorded this chapter. There is one thing I neglected to mention when positioning the joints. When you want to add an IK handle, and this is something we'll do together later, it is beneficial to keep all your joints aligned in one axis. This will make the joint's behavior more predictable when animating. To do this, you want to check the rotations on child joints. For example, this elbow has joint orient values on all three axes. Anatomically, our elbow can only bend in one axis. If I rotate this close to 180 degrees in Y, I want it to be inside of the shoulder bone. To fix this, we can zero out the joint orient in X and Z. Now when I do that, it will behave properly. However, you may have to adjust it back into place. To do this, you can offset from the parent joint. Because I moved the pivot in some of these joints, they may not be perfectly aligned. There are two things I want to make sure of before I bind my arm. First is that there are no rotational values on my joints. The second is that the joint aims down the bone. So if I go ahead and select everything, we could say Modify, Freeze Transformations. Keep in mind, you cannot freeze a joint's translations, but you can freeze the rotation. Maya has a unique attribute called Joint Orient, and this will store any joint offsets for the rotation here. Let's select these joints again. Go ahead and focus in on them. A good way to visualize your joint's orientation would be to go to Display, Transform Display, Local Rotation Axes. Now we can see the orientation of each selected object. I'm not too concerned about the end joints, which are automatically oriented to the world. Now let's properly orient our chains. We go up to Skeleton, Orient Joints option box. We now get some options on how to set our primary and secondary joint axis. The standards on this can vary from studio to studio. Your primary joint axis is the axis that your joint aims down. I'm just going to use the defaults, but I'll go ahead and show you by selecting our shoulder what's going to happen. If I hit apply, watch closely. Very subtle movements. I didn't change too much. When you lay out your joints, it will try to orient them on the fly. But if you change it, you might have to reorient them as I just did. Our secondary axis is set to Y, and our secondary axis world orientation is set to positive Y. What this means is that the axis, our secondary axis that we tell it to, is going to aim in the world's orientation. So now it's pointing up at Y, but if we were to set this to Z positive, then our secondary axis is going to aim forward in Z like so. If we didn't like that, we can just simply set it back. Great, let's go ahead and orient the rest of our chains. I notice here that I misnamed this, so I'm going to go ahead and fix that before I orient. And we only need to select the root of our chain to orient. So I'll go ahead and hit apply. And I'll do that for each of these as well. Once we're happy with our joint layout, I'm going to go ahead and select all my fingers, just the roots, and parent them into the hand. And then I'll parent the hand to the wrist. So now everything is in one chain, which is great when we go to mirror. So let's take a look at the front when we do this. With our root joint selected, we can go up to Skeleton, Mirror Joints, option box. We'll want to mirror across the YZ plane. Y is up, Z is forward. And for limbs, behavioral mirror is great. This will use the opposite orientation on the right side. So we'll also search for our left side naming and replace it with our right side naming. So if I go ahead and hit apply, because this is a behavioral mirror, the joint orientation is opposite. Now, if I rotate, the right side behavior is doing the same thing as the left, which is exactly what we would want for limbs. And there you have it. Our joints are now laid out on the left and right side. In the next lesson, we'll go over how we can attach our skin to these joints and start painting weights. Hey everyone. In this lesson, we'll take a look at how we can attach our character's skin to the joints that we positioned. Let's take a look at our bind skin options here in the skinning menu. For bind to, I like to use selected joints, just in case there are some influences in our hierarchy that we may want to omit. For the bind method, I'll just use the default. You can play around with the other options here to try and get a better initial bind, but there's usually a fair bit of work after we hit apply to do anyway. For the skinning method, I'll use classic linear. I'll go over these other two a little bit later on, but keep in mind, you can actually change the skinning method after you do your skin bind. For normalized weights, let's use interactive. Most riggers I've met prefer to use this, myself included. With interactive, the value per vertex will always equal 1. And this will hopefully make more sense in just a minute. The weight distribution I'm not too concerned about because we're still going to go in and clean up our weights after we bind. Allow multiple bind poses, we can leave this on. It basically will allow additional geo to have its own bind pose. We're only binding one piece of geometry, so it's not entirely relevant in this example. We'll leave max influences at 5 and maintain max influences on. Essentially, what this means is that at most, 5 joints can affect a single vertex. Vertex weighting is percentage based, so when you add up all your influences, you'll get a value of 1, or 100%. I can show you this visually once we bind our skin. We'll go ahead and leave the rest of these arguments at their defaults. Because we're using bind to selected, let's go ahead and select the joints we want to use as influences. These are referred to as bind joints. We don't need to bind the end joints, and it's not a great idea to bind overlapping joints. So we don't need to bind the wrist and the hand. Let's go ahead and only use our hand joint as an influence. With the joint selected, shift select your mesh and hit apply. The initial bind is a bit dirty, and we'll need to clean up these influences. Let's take a look at our weight map. Right-click your mesh and go to the Paint Skin Weights tool. If you scroll through these influences, you can see that there's a black and white weight map that represents the amount of influence each joint has on a given area. White represents a value of 1 and black is 0. I actually prefer to use the color ramp values. Black will still be 0 and white will still be 1, but now blue represents a value that is pretty close to 0 and red will represent a value that's almost 1. This makes it easier to see when a joint is influencing a vertex, even if it's only at a fraction of a percent. Before we start painting, let's go in and add a joint to represent our chest. I do skeleton, create joints. Place that right here, and we'll call it C chest joint. Select our joint, then just select the mesh. Go to Skin, Edit Influences, Add Influence. The only one we're going to change here is this lock weights argument. That way, when we add our new influence, it will not modify any of the existing weights that we have. Basically, it will add the influence with a value of 0 on each vertex. Go ahead and hit Apply. Let's go ahead and close this menu and take a look at our influences with the Paint Skin Weights tool. We now have this object, chest joint, and it's locked. Locked influences will not be affected by paint operations on other joints, but you can still paint directly onto a locked joint if you have that joint selected. I'm going to paint this area white so it's anchored to the chest. Let's take a look. You can see that there's still some influence here on the shoulder and maybe a few other joints as well. We'll want to clean that up some, but first, with these joints unlocked, I can pull values if I just paint over them using my Add or Replace brush. I'm going to set the smooth ball off to be hard using this profile. So go ahead and add my influences here. Go around and get the back and under the arm. It's not perfect, but it's a good starting point. So now if I go to my shoulder, I can see that all those influences have been removed. Let's go ahead and clean this shoulder up. Actually, let's go ahead and lock everything. Let's just say I want to lock inverse selected. So everything except my shoulder joint is locked now. Now if I paint with replace from this influence, set my value to 0, and just start painting, it's going to remove these influences and it's going to place them onto the unlocked joint, which is my shoulder. I'm just going to do that. Let's go back to the chest and the shoulder. Let's actually take our joint and we're going to rotate it up. Let's set a keyframe first. Press S. Now I'm just going to rotate this up and hit S again. This just makes it easier while I'm scanning so I can drag my timeline and see there's some change and I can get back to this point very easily. You just have to be sure to remove these before you publish your rig or save your scene. Cool. Here I'm using the smooth brush to blend between my two unlocked influences. Let's go ahead and remove these keys. Yeah, okay, cool. Now let's move on to the elbow. Again, I'm going to select my joint and set a keyframe. Go forward in the timeline and set another one. I can already tell that there's some influence here from either the chest or the shoulder, so let's go ahead and fix that first. I'm going to unlock my elbow, and I want to paint from this to here, so paint it off essentially. I'm done with my chest, so I can lock that. And I'm going to, with my replace tool, with a value of 0, I'll start to paint these off. And again, I might just speed this up. Okay, so this isn't great. I noticed the middle finger has some influences up here, so we want to go ahead and clean this up. Okay, so I'll just take the animation off this joint and move on to our wrist. For the wrist or hand, I kind of like to just paint it all white first and then go onto the fingers from there just with a clean, fresh palette. The reason is like weighting here is not so great and it's just gonna be easier to go one at a time. So I'm going to isolate select. Shift I is a hotkey to do that. And if I select all these verts, grab up here to wrist, go ahead and paint skin weights. With the vertexes selected, I unlock my hand joint. I'm actually going to unlock everything right now. So unlock inverse selection. And we're going to replace with a value of 1. So we'll take the weights from everything and put them onto the hand. Cool. So now there's no finger weights anywhere. Well, there's here, this index, we could still clean that up a little bit further, and we'll get to that. I might just speed up my playback again. Cool, so I'm happy with our hand joint. Let's go ahead and move on to our fingers. So I'm going to go from the tip all the way down. So I take that back. I'm going to go from the root out. So let's select all the faces of this finger. We'll start by flooding from the wrist or hand onto this pinky joint. onto the first pinky joint. So I'll collapse this. It's actually the second pinky joint we want. Unlock that. Go ahead and say add, or we could do replace as well, the value of 1. Now I'm going to set some keys here. We'll start cleaning up this joint. Now we can go down to the next joint, unlock this. We're going to want to replace these weights and put them onto this joint. We can use smooth flood. Just hit that a couple times and see where that gets us. While I'm in here, I'm just going to go ahead and do this last one too. I'm just going to use my brush for that. So with these two unlocked, just replace from this one directly onto my last pinky joint. You know, this placement's not great, so I actually want to move it up a little bit. Let me start by removing this key. Delete. And what I can do to fix this, we really want this to be lined up here. So I can go to skin and move skin joints. I can just slide that over. And then go ahead and press W. Now that pivot has changed. I'll go ahead and do the rest of these fingers now. All right, so as I'm going through each finger, I like to work on 2 influences at a time. It makes it easier to replace weights from one and have it end up on another. That way, when you're skinning and you replace weights, it doesn't end up somewhere else in your model on another joint, and you'll get what we call stray vertexes. And those don't look very pretty. It's also nice to be able to smooth blend between 2 joints at a time. So once I'm done with all the fingers, I'll move on to the thumb, which is pretty much the same concept. Different number of joints, but overall it's very much the same. And then when I'm done with that, I'll move on to the metacarpals. And just like the fingers, I'll unlock one metacarpal and the hand, and I'll be removing weights from the hand so that they end up on the metacarpal. When I'm done with that, I'll unlock 2 metacarpals at a time and blend smooth blend between the 2. Once we're satisfied with the skinning on the left side, we can go ahead and mirror that over to the right side. But first, let's select all the same corresponding joints and bind those to the right mesh. Take our end joints out and the wrist joint. Select our skin and bind skin. Now we have our default weighting, which is not very good. What we can do is select our left side, then select our right side, go to skin, mirror skin weights. We want to mirror across YZ. We can use closest component, and since I know my topology is the same, we can use 1-to-1. Go ahead and hit apply and close this. And now our skinning should be the same on both sides. It may take a little bit of time before you get completely comfortable with the skinning character process. So don't be discouraged if it's not working out right away or if it's taking a long time. Just take a step back and work through the problem slowly. In the next chapter, we'll take a look at dual quaternion and weighted blend, and how you can use those to improve your character skinning. I'll see you over there. Hey everyone, welcome back. There are just a couple things I want to show you before I get into dual quaternions. If you select your mesh and go into the node editor here and let's graph, I just want to show you what you get. So here you have all your influences for this skin cluster, so it's only the left side. We have our skin cluster, and that's going into the shape of our arm. So that's what's controlling the shape. One thing I want to do is rotate my arm. If you're ever unsure about whether or not your character is in its bind pose, meaning no changes have been made on any of the joints, you can turn on and off the skin cluster with this envelope. If it moves, you know that your joint has moved. Another thing that I want to point out is that whenever you deform your object, a shape or ridge node is made. And basically what this is an intermediate object. If I turn that off, you can see this is what my original mesh looked like before I deformed it. So it's making a copy, and it's using that to reference the original shape. So I'll hide that again. Let's also hide my node editor, and we'll just take a look at our elbow. I'm also going to turn off X-ray joints. If we go into our channel box, we can see on our selected object the skin cluster. Over here, and where it says skinning method, we can actually change this to be dual quaternion. You see what happened? Look at the elbow when I do that. What dual quaternion does is it tries to preserve a mesh's volume. So where it's bending and losing volume, it tries to pump that back out. But it doesn't always look great, so maybe we only want to add it in a couple areas. What we can do then is set this to weighted blend. So we'll actually blend between these two with a map. So now there's 0, and if I go into Paint Skin Weights tool, set this to DQ blend weight, now the influences here don't matter. This is a map from 0 to 1. I'm just going to go into my elbow. I'm going to add. I'm going to use a lower value. Just start painting some. Oh, I need to actually give it a value when I use add. I'll just start painting some influences here. And you see it starts to come out a little bit. And we're getting some more volume here, which is kind of nice. It's really good around elbows or knuckles and areas that bend. But you don't want to go too overboard and use the whole mesh. I'm just going to smooth this, hit it with a flood. There we go. Now, let's take a look. If I set it back to linear, it's losing volume. We go back to weighted blend, we get that. And if it's dual quaternion, it's going to be a value of 1 essentially for the whole mesh. So let's use our weighted blend. And one bit of bad news, if you are into rigging for games, dual quaternion will not port over into the game engine. Unless you're watching this a couple years after I made it, in which case they very well might have solved this problem. Alright, that's about all for skin weights for now, so I will see you in the next lesson on set-driven keyframes. Thanks for watching.